Reveal, like
The green.
yeah. It's on.
Okay.
You're good. It's very on.
What would it be? What's a good? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Okay, great. No problem.
So folks, we have to use the mic, just be sure to speak into the mic because there's people online. So
This doesn't. Oh, okay.
oh, they have.
All right. Oh.
All right. Well, welcome to this session entitled Structuring Place, Power, Planning, and the Built Environment. My name is Lacee Steinberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society here at Boston College. I'm also trained as a civil and environmental engineer, and I'm a member of the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Boston College. So what we're going to do in this session, we're going to have about 15-minute talks from Professor Lacee Satcher, Professor of Sociology at Boston College, and another approximately 15-minute talk from Professor Bish Sanyal of MIT. Then I'll speak for about 5 to 8 minutes from my vantage point as a civil and environmental engineer. And then we'll have a couple of questions that I'll moderate between the speakers, and then we'll come out for questions and answers with the group here. So let me begin by introducing our speakers. Lacee Satcher is an assistant professor of sociology and environmental studies at Boston College. Her primary research interests include race, ethnicity, health and place, and environmental justice. Her most recent work focuses on race-environment-health connection, specifically how various individual social identities and social locations structure our relations with and within space and place to shape health outcomes, health experiences, and place attachment. She holds a PhD in sociology from Vanderbilt University, as well as an MA in sociology and a BA in psychology from Jackson State University and Tougaloo College, respectively. Our second speaker is Bish Sanyal. Bish is the Ford International Professor of Urban Development and Planning and Director of the Special Program in Urban and Regional Studies, the Hubert Humphrey Program at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He served as head of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT from 1994 to 2002 and was chair of the entire MIT faculty from 2007 to 2009. Professor Sanyal's research covers a range of topics, including housing projects and politics in newly industrializing nations, the urban informal economy, planning organizations and theories of project implementation, history of planning ideas, and international planning education. We'll start with, welcome to our panelists. We'll start with Professor Satcher.
Right, thank you. All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for having me. And so I've entitled this talk and the forthcoming paper, Stigma in Place, What Sustains Attachment to Place in Stigmatized Urban Neighborhoods. And so although my co-panelists and I will both be discussing aspects of place attachment, the session title, Structuring Place, Power, Planning, and the Built Environment is appropriate. Why? Because to understand place and place attachment, it's important to first think about how power structures are embedded in and reflected across space. And so the core of my research is the intersections of inequality, the built-in natural environment, and health. And because of this, my scholarly identity traverses a few sociological subdisciplines, namely environmental sociology, urban sociology, medical sociology, and social psychology. Now, social psychology, with its inherent ability to link the macro and the micro and mediate agency and structure, rejects the traditional sociological spaces container argument and embraces the interplay of space, identity, and agency. And so, across social science, environment and place is defined and analyzed in various ways and capacities. The general structuralist view, before we get to that, I want to talk about what I'll be talking about. I left that out. So first, we're going to define environment and place across sociology. And then with that social psychological lens, we'll bridge social status, environmental inequality, and space. And then lastly, we'll think about those micro and macro connections, namely neighborhood stigma and place attachment. And I'll discuss that through the lens of my manuscript in progress. All right, there we go. Across social science, environment and place is defined and analyzed in various ways and capacities. The general structuralist view defines environment in terms of one's subjective and subjective realities, both, of course, which are socially constructed. While some fields tend to shy away from conceptualizing the environment as interactive, others have asserted the capacity of individuals to interact with the environment. Within the sociology discipline, many traditional sociologists, especially interested in urbanization, have examined the environment as merely a neutral place in which social phenomena occurs, a space that social groups influence, occupy, or use. Others in the field of sociology have emphasized the importance of the built and natural environment in social life, that the environment, built or natural, has not played a bigger role and has not been better emphasized in the field of sociology is kind of paradoxical. The environment, after all, plays a large role in structuring our social relations. More recently, environmental sociologists have stressed the importance of the examination of the environment in relation to social phenomena in order to grapple with the social problems of the world. So things like urban growth, disaster, crisis, and inequality. And each of these issues are not only influenced by geologic and climatic events, but they also influence the city's experience of catastrophe. And while sociological social psychology investigates environment to the extent that it's defined in terms of the social world, there's less emphasis on how the actual physical world, the actual physical and natural environment impacts our social relations. So in terms of the way that place is considered in sociology, though never explicitly, place has been extensively examined within the discipline as an integral element of historical change in social life. And although the fear of environmental determinism or lack of generalizability has affected sociologists' attention to place in the same way as their attention to the environment, many sociological studies of place are ever present. A review of sociological studies of place reveal a definition of place with three main features. They're unique, spatial locations of finitude, and have analytically and phenomenologically elastic boundaries. They have physicality, and they have invested in them both meaning and value. And so the overwhelming conclusion on the nature of place in terms of sociological function is that place matters for politics and history, inequality, identity, and community. So place attachment at the individual and community level is generally believed to be an attachment to a particular location, created and maintained through people's interactions with their environment and the people in that environment. Research demonstrates that factors such as length of residence, immigration status, degree of assimilation, neighborhood ties, and cultural capital affect place attachment. And likewise, place attachment can provide a sense of security and comfort, personal and group identity, and can help individuals develop a sense of community. So scholars have conceptualized place attachment in various ways, yet a consistent theme among these definitions is a description of place attachment as multidimensional, involving three factors: affect, behaviors, and cognitions. And so affect encompasses the emotional attachment individuals make to place, while behaviors refer to those actions that occur within the spatial context of place. Cognition then describes the beliefs, thoughts, and knowledge related to place. And so this three-dimensional definition of place attachment is what I use in my current research. So at the intersection of place, identity, and agency within the constraints of structure, many scholars posit this idea of using space as a means to provide an empirical understanding of how place can be an important mechanism for creating and reinforcing and restructuring individual and social identities, and also a space or mechanism for challenging ascribed status distinctions and outsiders imposed social designations. So building on these ideas, I draw from Kant's theory of territorial stigmatization to think about neighborhood stigma and its relationship to place attachment. And so territorial stigmatization is a good theory to draw on when examining place attachment among residents in disadvantaged or under-resourced or low-income neighborhoods and communities, as it argues that stigma tied to place becomes embedded, not only within the residents of that place, but at higher levels of the social, economic, and political hierarchy of place, including outsiders. So that means city and state residents outside of the neighborhood, journalists and news media, developers, and also city, state, and national politicians. And so bridging the research and theory on both place attachment and territorial stigmatization, my paper asks 3 questions. How do residents in an objectively resource-scarce neighborhood demonstrate attachment to their neighborhood? How do residents reflect and or reject external and internal neighborhood stigma? And then lastly, how do perceptions of neighborhood characteristics and stigma relate to place attachment among residents? That is, in what ways do the strategies designed to cope with stigmatization work for or work against the effective cognitive and behavioral components of place attachment? And so for time's sake, I'll focus mostly on the findings from this first question, and if time allows, I'll talk a bit about some of my findings from this second question. And so here's a snapshot of my sample. And so in summer 2019, I conducted 19 in-depth semi-structured interviews with 19 Black public housing residents in a multiply deserted area, which is just a neighborhood experiencing co-occurring resource scarcity in my hometown in Jackson, Mississippi. And so most respondents were women, less than half were employed, and only 6 were employed full-time, and just about half owned a personal vehicle. Let's get to the good stuff now. All right, so the effective cognitive and behavioral manifestations of place attachment became apparent almost immediately as residents shared narratives about how they ended up in the neighborhood. For some, living in this neighborhood was all that they had ever known, with generational ties to this area of the city. For others, this neighborhood was just one stop in their life's journey, a place of refuge after job loss, divorce, or familial disputes. Such residents were from other parts of the city or more rural parts of the state or from out of state. Interestingly, those who demonstrated less effective attachment had much more to say as it relates to their cognition and their relation to the neighborhood. And likewise, even respondents who demonstrated strong emotional connections to the neighborhood spoke at length regarding the cognitive elements of place attachment. And so across the sample, effective demonstrations of neighborhood place attachment were characterized by an attribution of emotions and sentimental feelings to other neighborhood residents. And so while initial gauges of effective attachment came from this question, do you feel like you have an emotional attachment to the neighborhood? Elements of effective attachment surfaced throughout the interviews, especially for longtime residents. The people and social relationships that they cultivated were a large part of their emotional attachment, as well as the memories and shared trauma of community members being killed and or passing away while living in the neighborhood. And so residents reflected on both good and bad times as they unpacked their emotional connection to the neighborhood. So with angst in his voice, Delroy explains his emotional attachment. I lost a couple friends. I've seen a couple friends get killed in this neighborhood. Grandma's from the neighborhood. Granddaddy died in the neighborhood. Stepdaddy died in the neighborhood, so that's one reason why. It's just my place. Chadwick asserts, it's just the people, just the neighborhood itself and the people. People that I've been knowing since like knee high. Now our children growing up together, and some of us, our grandchildren growing up together. I've known people that died and people that got shot and survived. Tanya had similar sentiments, recalling, my mother and grandmother are both deceased. We basically grew up out here, watching them grow up as parents, and they watched us grow up as kids. So Delroy, Chadwick, and Tanya's explanations highlight how place can become personally significant through death, similar to the habitual visits to the grave sites of those with whom individuals shared close personal ties, as well as the places where these individuals died. Death fosters emotional ties to places one might otherwise find insignificant. For those who demonstrated little effective attachment to the neighborhood, responses regarding neighborhood social relationships and emotional connectedness were terse and ambivalent. Victor confesses, well, I don't feel attached. I feel like that's where I'm staying at for now because that's where I'm at. I'm just here trying to leave. Likewise, these emphatic no responses centered around the neighborhood not being the place residents spent their childhood or a place in which their family resided. Monica asserts, no, not really, because that wasn't where I grew up at. Like if I left, it wouldn't just hurt me like that. James explains, no, I never. I hadn't stayed in this location long enough to form a personal attachment. And neither has my family, or extended family. Initial gauges of cognitive attachment came from the question, does this neighborhood have a name? All residents responded yes to this question, but the name of the neighborhood varied. And so after this initial question, much of the residents' cognition centered around the nature of their connection to the neighborhood, the positive and negative impacts, and how the neighborhood had changed since they moved in. In their responses to these prompts, many residents spoke to how the neighborhood had provided them with things they found valuable, or what Sanyal and Gifford referred to as place affordances. These benefits were usually abstract and consistently emerged when residents spoke about themselves in relation to the neighborhood and reflections on the positive and negative impacts of the neighborhood. In explaining her connectedness, Mahogany maintained, a lot of my character comes from my neighborhood, the way I am, the person that I am. Does it define who I am? No, but the makeup of me comes from being out here in this area. In the same way, Chadwick contended, it taught me how to be strong, taught me how to survive under any circumstances. I just about know how to deal with any situation because of this neighborhood. Residents also drew upon salient positive memories in the neighborhood, and these recollections demonstrated cognitive attachment as well. Many of the residents' happy memories centered around community events either within the bounds of the housing project or across the neighborhood outside of the gates of the housing project. So Vernon, a lifelong resident of the neighborhood, excitedly calls to mind a Halloween celebration from his childhood. I remember when, for Halloween, the whole neighborhood, the whole neighborhood was like a huge haunted house. The kids got to go around inside the neighborhood and trick or treat, and that was just amazing. Similarly, Victor calls to mind the yearly neighborhood festival. We just chilling in one big old park. That's the only thing that really just keep a neighborhood together, that festival. As in other neighborhoods, community and neighborhood-wide events seem to simultaneously provide residents with opportunities for recreation and socializing while also fostering cognitive attachment. Now, in contrast to many other residents' general concerns about crime and safety in the neighborhood, Phoebe alluded to her feelings of safety and comfortability as the main abstract benefit of the neighborhood, that the neighborhood offered. She explains, I never had my house broken into or anything like that. So I feel like it's a good area. That hasn't happened since the whole time I've been staying over here. So I feel safe. While most residents who demonstrated greater cognitive attachment emphasized the neighborhood's abstract benefits, some residents' cognitions were negative. Many residents tied their negative cognitions to tangible things and characterized the neighborhood in terms of crime and safety, infrastructure, and material resources. James irritatingly declares, which is probably one of the things that discouraged me the most about this neighborhood, is because there's not much around. That convenience store right there is about the closest, and other than that, there's nothing. And if you're already, kind of struggling to get around, it becomes a chore. Moreover, while most residents emphasize their relationships with neighbors as a source of effective and cognitive attachment, justice was one of the few exceptions. In contrast to the majority of residents in the sample, frustrations with her neighbors alienated her from the neighborhood. She explains, they do a lot of arguing and all that. Come outside their house and cussing. They had to call the police the other day. So I don't feel like I'm a part of what they doing. Other residents' negative cognitions came up in describing how they felt the neighborhood had changed. For example, Pam recalls, when I first moved over here, it was all right then. All down the line, it just started being them bad people, shooting folks over there and everything. But when I first moved over there, it was nice and quiet. Wasn't no stuff going on. Interestingly, even respondents who demonstrated strong, emotional, affective connections to the neighborhood also demonstrated negative cognitions. These discussions were markedly in contrast to their affective discussions. So Tanya, a resident who had a strong emotional attachment to the neighborhood, differentiated between the neighborhood as a place she felt emotionally attached to and the community to which she was not connected to. She reveals, the community that I stay in is not a good community. I don't feel like I have any trustworthy friends over there or somebody I can trust in order to say, hey, can you help me out? Without trying to steal something from your house or see what's inside your house or trying to get in your business or tell your business. And so the statement highlights the differences between attachment to place as a geographical thing and attachment to community as a social thing, and how those social ties that make up one's community attachment can shape place attachment. And so behavioral aspects of attachment were entangled throughout residents' explanations of their emotional and physical connectedness to the neighborhood, as well as residents' discussions of actual access. Residents' behaviors involved both instrumental behaviors and consummatory behaviors. So Vernon, a lifelong resident, charismatically talks about his time spent volunteering with Caring Hands, which is a local nonprofit that's very close to the housing project. One of the things that keeps me there, one of the things that I'm really proud of, is I still do volunteer with the local nonprofit in our community called Caring Hands. So I get to mentor some of the young people there, and it really brightens up my day. Plus, I know everybody. That this volunteer work keeps Vernon in the neighborhood speaks to how meaningful consummatory behaviors demonstrate and continue to foster place attachment. Residents' consummatory behaviors also emphasize sentimental values embedded in certain neighborhood locations. Reflecting this idea, Chadwick recalls his attachment to a nearby park. I go to Summer Park because I went to school. I went to P.T. Marshall, the school right down the street from it, and we used to go to field trips there and walk there. I got a lot of sentimental value with that park. Residents' instrumental behaviors also demonstrated attachment to the neighborhood. Monica's connection to the neighborhood is linked to being able to shop within the neighborhood, and she explains, I do feel connected. That's where we do all of our shopping at now. We don't have to go all the way across town, so I feel real connected to it. Tanya, a resident who demonstrated strong affective attachment and much less cognitive attachment, revealed through her behaviors that although there were no feelings of community from her adult neighbors, there was connectedness to the children in her neighborhood. When asked what kinds of things she does in the neighborhood, Tanya proclaims, I cooks. Basically, I'm the house where the kids come to when they want to watch a movie or they're mad at their mama. I'm basically auntie. They call me auntie. Here it's evident that place attachment itself and residents' evaluations of various dimensions of that attachment are often inconsistent. So other residents decidedly spent no time in the neighborhood or with neighborhood residents, spending most of their time, quote, at work or sleep. Some of these residents avoided their neighbors for fear of misunderstandings and drama, while others were busy with life or simply preferred solitude. Both James and Phoebe are cases in point. When asked about things he does in the neighborhood, James maintains, I just survive. I take care of myself. I have a lot of medical issues, that keeps me busy. I'm single and pretty solitary, so I spend most of my time just basically taking care of myself. Echoing this attitude, okay. So let me wrap up. These are just more quotes about those affect, behavior, and cognitions. And so in general, attachment to neighborhood centers around these social resources, and then resident responses to stigma vary, and those residents' responses to stigma impacts how attachment plays out for these residents. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. I want to share with you a few things that I have been studying. When I was asked to talk about attachment, etc., I thought, whose attachment are we talking about? The group I know best, because I've studied them for a long time, are migrants to the city in developing countries. A very specific group, so you cannot generalize from their experience, but still the things I learned and what I'm struggling with now, that's what I'm going to share with you. So we call migration and attachment is a kind of migration is about movement, about change, and attachment is about getting with a fixed place. Done. Okay, so the story, you probably know this basic, but I think the framework is very important to understand what change meant when these countries come out of colonial rule. And there were 4 sets of modernization principles, and all require change. So you have economic modernization, which is rapid industrialization, And these were mostly subsistence economies with a lot of people living in the rural areas. And I'll come to the minute in the economic theory that basically justified induced migration from rural to urban areas. Political modernization, this idea of Western-style democracy and nation building. Nation building was very important at that stage. And also turning from tribal governance to Western-style democracy. Social modernization, if you look at this idea of this kind of superstitious peasants that were there before in the rural area, how to make them rational man or rational woman who will be the new citizen of this country. So from subjects to citizenship in a new nation. And spatial modernization was something we study in the city. The city, why the city got so much attention at that moment, and I'll come to it in a minute. So basically to keep in mind that there's this huge process of social transformation that we were expecting at that moment. And what did we know about transformation, and what did we know about managing such huge transformation on all four fronts? So if you look at the basic theory of Arthur Lewis, who got Nobel Prize for this article, the dual sector economic model, it's a very clear model of how these nations, which were subsistence economies, rural, how will they become urban and industrialized? And there are two sets of relationships, unequal relationships, which Arthur Lewis wanted to suggested that we build on this unequal relationship. We make those a center part of the story. Rural and urban. Rural, in terms of rate of return of investment, rural is much lower than urban. So let's focus on the urban. That's where you don't have a lot of money. You want to make money, you want to create capital, focus on places where the rate of return is higher. And of course, there's the urban theory of agglomeration, why urban is better. I won't go into detail. Agriculture and industry, similar argument. Agriculture is not going to lead the country. Agriculture is there to feed the working class, urban working class, etc. But the bulk of the nation is going to move through industry, through export. And so there was very clear that out of this situation where bulk of the people are in the rural area, you want to move them. And that's why he meant by unlimited supply. Look at the word, unlimited supply of labor, that if you move them out from the rural to the urban area, the opportunity cost, as the economists say, will be zero. That they're there in the rural areas doing nothing, right? And so you can move them, and then the production, agricultural production will still not go down, and you will have them come to the city. They will lower the wage, working class wage, which will give you comparative advantage in the global economy to produce things and export. And you need the low wage for that. So it's a very clear plan. So the domains of attachment, what we look at this in terms of work, I look at the three domains. I mean, even they're somewhat arbitrary, but I think just let me go through this. So in work, what was our assumption about how will people get attached to the work? Peasants who are working in the fields, they are totally attached to their area. They live there, they have their whole life there. You are saying the migrants will create the new working class. Okay, so there are assumptions here how this peasant is going to become the working class, and how will the work situation change his or her sense of attachment. Factory floor connections, borrowing from the Western experience, we thought there'll be new kind of relationships will be created in the work. There'll be factory workers, they'll be, the way it happened in the Western countries, they'll become friends, etc. Unions as organizations is very interesting because many people thought, so unions is a new form of social organization that would bring this working class together, and they would be able to bargain. This is a classical Western model. That was the expectation. On the home, we thought, okay, they're coming. We don't have all the houses because the market is not provided all the houses. So the government is going to provide houses, but not so much in the beginning for the poor. But it was basically the new bureaucrats who are going to get this public housing. Which public housing has a very different connotation in many other countries than the U.S. And so they will live there. So a lot of single men are coming to the city. They'll be in this dormitory style lodging for single men. Now this is not uncommon. Actually, in many of the colonial countries, before colonial powers left, this is what they did with the people. In Africa, where I worked for a number of years, the people wouldn't let them come. And if they come to the work, put them in the dormitory in the evening, go back to your dormitory. Don't even stay in the city. Right? That was the objective. On community, this is interesting because the whole idea of what they had before, these tribal attachments, the way people talk about tribal and tribalism or tribal attachment was terrible. Like as if they're peasants, they know nothing, they are superstitious. I mean, come on, you need to make the nation grow. You need to change these attachments. And one will be, this idea of borrowing from Durkheim about this idea of mechanical versus organic solidarity. So basically, Durkheim was saying, mechanical solidarity is what you are born into. Organic is what you create, right? So he was saying, in development, mechanical solidarity will have to go. The peasants will have to leave their old attachments, their old relationships, but they will create new relationships in the city, in terms of organic solidarity. And how so? Sports teams, a lot of stuff written on trade unions, political parties as a new means of new solidarity. So again, the political party, formation of political party in a democratic system is a very central part, right? So we thought, okay, they will become members of political parties, new parties, left, right, and then that will be their form of association. So how did these models hold up? First of all, I think I want to say that by the mid-60s, I'm talking about this, let's say, after Second World War to mid-60s, serious disappointment about this model on all four fronts. Economically, countries that grew a little bit in the beginning the economic rates start declining, including Brazil, which was that time a poster boy. Second, politically, all these Western-style democracies that they tried to create, by 1972, Latin America had two democratic countries. All had become authoritarian, right? Socially, old tribal connections, people say, oh, they'll change. Their tribalism is going to go. We are going to create a nation, right? It will be a new nation. Well, we found they're still very attached, and logically so, right? And spatially, the cities, it was a disaster for urban planning because, we realized that these cities they can provide housing, they can provide jobs. People are living in these peripheral settlements, quarter settlements, etc. And that's why the city is not this modern city that we had expected to happen. Employment housing, similar thing. We'll go into the detail, informal housing and people making a living without a formal job. Forget the factory floor. The bulk of the people now, still majority of the people make a living in informal work. So what happened? What we found out, the scholars argued, we began to rethink the field. And we started saying slums, which in the beginning when they were coming up, basically we just went and bulldozed, saying this is terrible, this is where prostitution happens, this is where drug comes from, etc. Let them move. Then you realize you cannot move everybody. Bulk of the people are living there, and your housing market is not providing the housing that they can pay for, right? So they start rethinking reinterpreting a new ideology of how to justify the present. So slums serve as important social function. And this book by John Turner. And particularly one thing I want to say, the poor provide housing and jobs for themselves because when both the state and the market has failed them. So they have nothing else, they have to do it themselves. And in that process of being put to themselves, they have become very innovative. They have done so much with so little. And John Turner has this main quote, look at the state with how much, how little they have done, and look at the poor with how little, how much they have done. Right? So it's a very interesting combination. New approaches to the urban labor market. I mean, it's in the 1970s, informal economy people began to say, oh, the informal economy actually is better than the formal because it's less capital intensive. It doesn't that uses capital in a much more efficient way. I'm going through fast. Work in new paradigms, informal sector earnings over time. People began to say, no, in the early part, these informal sector people, the whole bunch of literature on that, where the revolution is going to come from. Is it going to come from these peasants, or is it going to come from this working class that is actually suffering in the margin? The new work shows, no, they're actually very conservative people. They're not interested in revolution. They actually want to go up the higher ladder. They look at their stay in these places as a stepping stone. They're looking up. They're not trying to disrupt the system. And slums as a ladder for the future. Autonomy, sense of autonomy is a very important issue in this, about how the poor, because they are not controlled by anybody, they have created their own jobs, they have built their own home from scratch. It has given them a sense of autonomy, which the assumption is that that's the source of the attachment, a sense of autonomy, without which you don't have. So new paradigm, mechanical and organic solidarity. Now people are talking about economy of affection. I don't know if you use the term here in the looking at it, but basically what this means is that when you don't have a lot of money and you need support for your, let's say you run out of sugar, you go and ask somebody else tomorrow, do you have some sugar? They say, sure. Next day they'll come and ask you, do you have any flour, right? So there's a barter. Because they're so vulnerable in the market economy that what they are left with is economy of affection, which is the basis of the attachment. So where do we go from here? I want to end with this. So how do people who migrate reconstruct meaning about their lives? Now this should have been a question that should have been asked 70 years back. But we didn't ask. We thought it will be just like Western countries. Well, it's same happened in England, same happened in Germany, same happened in the US. People migrate and they reconstruct their lives. It's not that simple. That we don't understand the process of adjustment. And then if you look at the historical works by people like E.P. Thompson, etc., and you read the diaries of these people's houses, I mean, it was very painful what they had to go through. The process of rural urban migration is not an easy process. It's a very difficult process, and I don't think we know enough of how through this change, how people construct meaning. Peter Maris's book I want to acknowledge because I worked with him. He was a British social psychologist, which really blew my mind once. Peter Maris gives a theory of change, basically looking at people like, women who lose their husbands, widows. And he was looking at how widows, when they go through the change, how they reconstruct meaning of their lives. And he found in England, you go to people's houses, the photographs of the husband who is dead, there's a picture of him with food, flour, as if he's alive, as if he's going to eat those things. He's gone. But the issue is, if you don't acknowledge that step, if you get up in the next morning and said, I'm a widow, you cannot deal with that sharpness of the thought. You need a set of rituals of grieving that helps you to move from what you were to what you are doing now. So you need to pretend as if things haven't changed to actually accept change. Now that's a powerful theory of how people adjust. And so I think that generally speaking, I would say social science, for me, I don't know, you've done a lot of work on social science. For me, social science doesn't really explain the real depth of what's going on. I find it much more in fictional writing, in novels, short stories. They don't explain. That's not their purpose. The purpose is to describe what's happening, right? And I find that descriptions much more thoughtful, much more sophisticated than these ideas of either, and here I go about this calculus, which I mean, economics is based on calculus. dy by dx that's how you create change. And imagine reducing this complex process of transformation to the term dy by dx. How crude that can be? How crude can that be that you explain change that way? So, and now I'm going to say what's ahead. We can talk about it. I think that we are trying to formalize these informal settlements. We are trying to change the homes for making people build their homes, and community solidarity attachment. People are rethinking, because a lot of work now on this issue of extremism. And where are these people being cultivated? What is the situation doing? How are they becoming more extreme? It's a very important question to probe, because politically, the times are very difficult. And I think, so there's a lot to study here. I'll end with that.
I'm sorry. All right, I'll talk for a few minutes as the dydx person, speaking as an engineer. Derivative of y with respect to x. But I'll just speak briefly. So as I mentioned, I'm a civil environmental engineer, and as compared to other forms of engineering you may be familiar with, civil and environmental engineering is very, very place-based. Nearly everything we do is site-specific. It's linked to a particular community, topography, or ecosystem. Civil engineers build major infrastructures, like bridges, tunnels, dams, and high-rise buildings, and environmental engineers change the landscape by constructing facilities to provide clean drinking water or purify air and soil in the attainment of public and ecosystem health. We may employ nature-based solutions to protect sensitive environments. Not only must civil and environmental engineers be cognizant of the locales we are working in and the peoples and the environment that are served in creating new infrastructure or protecting wetlands, but we also need to be cognizant of the impact our designs and structures will have on these communities. Well, for a long time, our designs and plans focused on, quote, what made sense in terms of efficiency and cost, such as optimizing mobility to economic centers, avoiding bedrock that would be expensive to build upon, or siting landfills in conveniently located valley areas. As Lacee referred to, these decisions and structures that we built in the past reflected the priorities of those who held economic and political power and did not reflect many of the other concerns that we know are important. So we all know now the ill effects that this had on neighborhoods by polluting urban landscapes, splitting neighborhoods apart, ramming mass transit through densely populated areas, destroying ecosystems, among many others. So what was missing from the engineers, and to be honest, the city planners and policymakers' view? What was missing from their view? Well, first, there was missing a sense of equity and social justice, and a recognition of the impacts these designs would have on the landscape and the lives of the people. Two, there was missing the respect for the stories of lived experience and community-held knowledge. And three, there was missing a recognition of the attachment to place that helps drive this lived experience and the aspiration of community members and neighborhood residents. So indeed, in many ways, I would argue that infrastructure is in fact a defining feature of the landscape and is burrowed deep in attachment to place. There are iconic structures that people and communities look to as symbolic of their neighborhoods. Where they grew up, symbolic of where they raised their kids, symbolic, I've learned recently, of where folks died, and symbolic of where they partied. Think of the Brooklyn Bridge, or in my father's case, the Williamsburg Bridge, as an example. It speaks to accessibility for him from his packed tenement in an outer borough to the majesty of Manhattan. Recall the popular 50s rock tune about young love, Under the Boardwalk. Or your own experiences in the Boston Common Gardens. Particular subways or T stations may become embedded in our memories, evoking in some case positive or potentially negative feelings. We reminisce about our elementary school playgrounds, and perhaps we recall that particular pond with the engineered beach that we liked to go swimming in. Here, for a moment, Dorchester resident Renee Walsh, as she talks about Boston's plans to convert to currently, this is currently happening, to convert White Stadium in Franklin Park to a professional soccer stadium. Quote, "It saddens me that our city has now decided to cut up our park to the highest bidder without public input or the community surrounding the park, how they feel and what they see. I'm very passionate about this because this is where my family grew up. We played soccer in this park. We played cricket in this park. This was our park. This is our park. This is the same park we would clean up on the weekends when the city forgot about this park, and we had to clean it up." So at the same time, my statement now, at the same time that existing infrastructure can embody a deeply felt meaning for community, infrastructure can confront and challenge our sense of place. We see that happening throughout Massachusetts now, as towns like Milton resist the building of affordable housing in their neighborhoods, claiming that it is inconsistent with the community as they see it. We saw that many years ago in Boston, as the Big Dig was planned. Good for transportation around the region, at least in some ways, but it came at the expense of changing the ways of life in many neighborhoods in the city. And of course, with climate change, the pressures for adapting to rising sea levels, drought, and extreme weather events are already starting to stimulate changes in the spaces we inhabit. There are $50 billion in federal funds for this in the Federal Infrastructure Security Act, and many more billions will be spent by local and state governments to protect our coastline communities with seawalls and potentially massive pumping stations, as we saw in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. We'll be shoring up our water supply reservoirs, and we'll be looking for new solutions like desalination plants and water recycling facilities. As areas of the country heat up, we're already seeing an increased need for cooling capabilities, employing more energy infrastructure on the horizon, even as we try to transition to cleaner fuels and try to reduce everyday energy use. So to conclude here, as the nation and local communities plan for these broad-scale changes to the landscape, it will be key to avoid the mistakes of previous centuries and even our very recent past, and ensure that attachment to place is a recognized and respected component to our current and future infrastructure efforts and plans. All right, so what I'd like to do now is just ask a question or two of our speakers, and then turn it over for questions and answers. So I think what I'd start with is, what we heard from both speakers, and a little bit of from what I said, is that neighborhoods have a very rich life, and that neighborhoods help to be a source of pride and a source of the sense of attachment. And you both talked about that in somewhat different ways, but I think there were some commonalities. One thing that I was thinking about was this question of housing, which came up in both of your talks. Yeah. That in your talk you were talking about how people created their own housing, and that was a way that they could innovate. And Lacee, you talked about housing as the projects that folks lived in and the buildings that they lived in and how they did or didn't feel comfortable there. So maybe if you could each comment a little bit more about how housing helps to shape the sense of attachment of place.
So I do a lot of work with residents of public housing. And fun fact, this public housing project, just 2 years before, I was a resident of that public housing project before I went to grad school, which was why it was such a great place to do the interviews. So when I think about public housing, in particular this particular housing project, and public housing in general, public housing is sometimes framed by residents as like a place where you go when you're down on your luck, and it'll give you like a little breathing room to be able to get some sort of upward social mobility and move on. Many residents speak about public housing as like a trap. Like once you're there, you get stuck. And in this set of interviews with residents in Jackson a few years ago, and with more recent research with residents in Maryland McCormick in South Boston, there are generations, which meaning mom moved in back in the 80s or 90s when she was pregnant, or when her child was just a toddler, and now the toddler is an adult and they have their own unit there, right? And so for some people that's great, like they think of housing as a right, and so they're not looking to move up or move on, and they have really strong ties. But for others, it's, in quoting them, it feels like jail, it feels like prison, it feels like a sentence. Yeah.
Thank you.
Interesting. Well, the situation is very different in the cases that I was referring to, because most of this housing is on informal land. They're not even the owners. Right? So there's a constant battle with the government as to how can they stay there, because the government can say you're not the owner, but where are they going to go? So the fight about legal rights for that's a bigger fight now, and I think that often brings the solidarity of the people, that they have a common fight.
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
Bish, is there anything you'd like to ask Lacee?
First, thank you for the presentation. I mean, you went through a lot of stuff.
Thank
But
you.
what I
I wasn't
wanted to
making
ask
sure.
you, one thought I had, and I think your last response, in a way, suggested that it's neither, the community is neither this great idea of a community always. There are moments of solidarity and there are moments of terrible treachery. It's not one or the other.
Right.
And I think so. So when we paint a picture, it's easier for us to paint it one way. You know, it's either this glorification of the word community, or it's saying it's terrible. It's like the people used to think it's a horrible bit of revolution. So how, in your own work, how do you differentiate between these complex, different modes of social forces that create what we call community?
So I think the sentiments for these residents, as well as just, and I think broadly when we talk about like human interaction, right, and what community means broadly, whether it's community via close proximity or community via some sort of similarity and identity, et cetera. It's nuanced, and it can go to both extremes, right? And that's just the nature of humans being these complex creatures. And so I can say more, but am I getting at what you're trying to ask? I think it's very nuanced. Community is, and because humans are, like I said, really complex creatures, and you can find community and build solidarity against, like, again, a common enemy, which happens a lot along class lines, along racial lines, and then even within community there can be conflict. But I don't think either of those two extremes is something that's abnormal for folks in general. Yeah.
Lacee, is there anything that surprised you when Bish was talking about how when migrants move from rural areas to city areas, they continue to maintain their sense of connection and community with each other?
No, only because I sort of saw the parallel with the migration, the Great Migration, right? The migration of Black residents in the South up north, but also the migration of Black folks in the rural South to the more urban South, and still maintaining those ties to, you know, what they had before, the communities that they had before. Sometimes whole communities left, right? And so because we know place attachment to be largely social, right? It's embedded in place, but it's largely held together by the social stuff, and less held together by the material stuff. It made a lot of sense that people would maintain those identities, and we see that for immigration across race and ethnicity, right? Where folks, if we're talking about U.S. Immigrants, still maintain ties and cultural ties, food, dance, and they bring it here, right? And they don't abandon it in most cases. So not surprised at all.
Great. All right, let's open it up to questions from the audience. Yes, we have a question here.
It's a question for Bish, but I'll stand up so you can see me. At the time of independence in 1947, Mahatma Gandhi envisioned an India of an aggregation of self-sustaining rural communities, in each spinning their own khadi cloth and having their own produce. How did India, in its subsequent development, veer off so sharply and badly from Gandhiji's vision? And a comment about those big slums. Yes, the government may say to those people, you don't own the land, but the government is busy harvesting their votes. And this is certainly the case of the big slums in Dharavi and away from Bombay airport to the city, right? And that's how the Shiv Sena and all have gotten their majorities, in part in the regional parliament. So democracy is partly at fault for one of the factors you mentioned for the growth of these slums. But about Gandhiji, yes. Thank you.
Well, the two different questions. Gandhiji's approach was very well established. He really believed in the rural. He didn't like our migration. He didn't believe in industrialization. But Gandhiji was not running the show after the independence. It was Nehru and the whole group of this kind of socialist liberals that ran the show, where industrialization was totally agreed that we have to industrialize as a nation. So Gandhiji was lone voice in that way. But of course, people often talked about the budget. If you look at the national budget, the money we spent on rural was more than many other countries, partly because of the rural, because the bulk of the people were there. But if you look at the aspiration of the country, it was industrialization, urbanization, industrialization. What did Nehru do? What is the creation of Chandigarh? Chandigarh is a showcase to show the world that this is going to be our city, right? So it was. I think that the people often, pray to Gandhiji, etc. But if you really look at what he was pushing, I don't think it was really followed. Go ahead. I can't hear you.
Just a quick follow-up. In most instances, Gandhiji was Nehru's mentor. So why did Nehru and Cabal move away so sharply in this aspect from his vision?
Why they didn't turn to Gandhiji?
No, they would follow Gandhiji's precepts. He was their mentor in many ways, but in this way, they split with him. Why?
Because Nehru was very influenced by Western industrialization. He thought that's the way to industrialize. We saw in a liberal democratic way, not the communist version of what was happening in Soviet Union. But the goal was that he had decided that the country is too poor. Like we said, what are the peasants? Nehru was extremely skeptical of religious things, you know that. And so because he thought that's going to hurt the poor, right? They are superstitious. It's too simple. How the poor construct meaning, which is what I'm trying to understand, it's much more complex than to say, oh, they are superstitious, they are not superstitious. Yeah. Certain things are extremely rational. They have no choice but to be rational. Because when you have so little, every decision is you have to be rational, right? And then we said, no, these are irrational peasants. The rationality is in the city. And look what we ended up with.
All right, thank you. We have another question in the back. Yes.
I wanted to ask a question of both of you. One is about the distinction between attachment through individual biography or family biography and that of collective memory. Usually when we talk about place, it's collective memory that is operative rather than an individual's emotional attachment. So that's one thing. And with respect to migrants from rural to urban, just as we see with international migration that there's actually transnational ties, and people circulate and go back home. So they maintain attachments both to their place of origin as well as in their new homes. And it's really the second generation that finds attachment to place to be problematic. The first generation is still getting settled, but also in the case of India, there's a lot of circular migration. One member of a family will be sent to the city to send money home to maintain the rural economy. So there's a lot of circulation that goes on. So collective memory reflects permanence, a certain amount of continuity, and long-term interaction among neighbors. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the individual versus collective and the generational permanence versus the temporal changes.
Interesting.
So that's a great question. And in the background of a lot of my slides, I had that intersection, that exit on Medgar Evers Boulevard, which was right off where the public housing project where I interviewed these residents was, but it's named after Medgar Evers because just a block over was Medgar Evers' home. Medgar Evers was a civil rights leader that was very crucial to the civil rights movement, and he was murdered in his driveway, a block away from where this public housing project was. And so in residence, so of course I talked a bit about the individual stuff in the family ties that were really powerful for attachment, but also that sentiment, living off of Medgar Evers Boulevard and talking about their relation to, for some people, for some of the residents, like being alive when it happened, not in that housing project, because I don't believe it was built just yet, but just being a Jackson resident when that happened and having that proximity, and just the history overall of Jackson, Mississippi in the civil rights movement was really permanent. Across the street from the public housing project was a library, Fannie Mae, right? Fannie Mae Library, named after another really powerful Black woman around in civil rights and social justice movement, right? And so embedded in place in Jackson are these symbols that really continue to sort of allow that collective memory for Black residents to like persist. It ties them to the neighborhood for sure, in the broader city for sure.
Well, very, very quickly, I would say that's a very important question you ask. I've focused more on the individual in this case of the migrant, but I want to stress one thing which may not have come through because I went through very quickly. I think it is very clear now that any change, particularly through migration, where you have lost, where you're leaving your own place, is a disruption of your meaning, which was on Peter's work, and you need to reconstruct the meaning to function. The process, what is that process of reconstruction? Does it happen individually, or does it happen, the reconstruction, when you're with a group of similar people? None of them have housing, none of them have jobs, none of them have enough income, right? So I think that how do we reconstruct meaning, and what role social other things play, I think is a really interesting issue.
All right, well, let's thank our speakers. And I think we're going to be at the dinner tonight, so we look forward to more conversation and questions and discussions with all of you.
So quick coffee break, just about 10 minutes coffee break, and please come right back for the